Sonic 06 has a whopping 9 different playable characters, but today we're only using one of them to see if they can beat Sonic's story on their own, and the other stories later down the line. Shadow's abilities are quite limited compared to the others, so we'll have to think of creative ways to get past obstacles, or just glitch the game. Let's get into it. Our adventure starts in the Soleanna hub, with 2 shadows. Yeah, with this mod everyone is shadow, even your friends. Shout out to the creator, by the way. We first need to cross the ocean here with a light speed dash, but in order to do that, we need the light ship, for which we need rings. Normally we would get that by doing this mission. Alright, no problem. We'll just go through all these rings. Oh, wait, what? Come on, Shadow, just get to the rings. Okay, this isn't working. For some reason, Shadow doesn't have as much air control as Sonic after bouncing on a spring. And with no other way to gain height, this mission is unbeatable. And it's seemingly the only way to actually get rings. We can't even go anywhere with all these invisible walls blocking the way. Oh wait, yeah, this is Sonic 06. Invisible walls mean nothing. So we get access to this part of Soleanna that we're not supposed to be in yet, where we find this level entrance, which could be a good place for rings, but it doesn't work. So I get to this door instead that you can easily get behind from the side here. Though there is another door for some reason, but I also managed to glitch through that one and load it into Soleanna Forest, where I'm greeted by stop signs? Is the game trying to get me to stop? Am I just delaying my inevitable failure? Fuck that, I'm not letting a measly traffic sign stop me, so I walk around the forest to see if there's any sign of life or rings. And no, it was empty as fuck. So I decided to see what would happen if hypothetically we got rings and bought a light ship. And it doesn't even work. We basically just bought it for Sonic, not for Shadow. So I'll have to somehow cross this gap, but how are we going to get that much distance? The homing attack definitely doesn't get us far enough. We have this Gale Spear move, but that doesn't really help us travel any distance. Or does it? Yeah, you actually are able to travel some distance by spamming the Gale Spear. You still fall down a very small amount each time, but it does get us a little further, but it still wasn't enough. I needed some extra height. Oh yeah, of course, the roofs. So I got onto this roof, jumped off the edge and started spamming, and eventually I made it. So we can finally enter the first level, Wave Ocean. So usually Sonic slides over this water, but this was never programmed for Shadow, and this first bit is completely automated. I pressed every button on my controller and it did nothing, so there literally isn't anything I can do. So is the challenge over? No, of course not. We'll just see how many levels and bosses we can beat as Shadow, and we'll just count the amount of times we have to use Sonic. Though that means Wave Ocean as Shadow is unbeatable. So thus far we've had to cheat once. Not off to a great start, but what comes next is more promising. We have to save the skid on this roof by sliding under this little gap, for which we need the anti-gravity from the shop. I was a little worried at first because Shadow can't do the slide, but just simply buying the anti-gravity allows us to go under it anyways by using Shadow's spin kick. Now that that's sorted, we can go to the desert, where we fight our first boss, the Cerberus. This one's pretty simple. We just have to make this Dagu run into a wall by grabbing onto his horn. Luckily, Eggman conveniently placed grind rails on his back so Shadow can reach the horn easily. Yeah, he should have probably thought that through. Beatable. We move on to Dusty Desert, where we are met with a small problem. Usually you carry Elise around and use the power of 2 to activate the shield that lets you cross the quicksand. But Shadow is alone, so we can't do that. Luckily we can just jump and homing attack over the first few gaps of sand. But then we find this bigger gap. Though for some reason after landing on the quicksand, Shadow can just do a little hop. Then it's pretty smooth sailing until this part. You'd have to use the light speed dash here, but as we know, Shadow can't do that yet, so I tried jumping and homing attacking over it, but I kept barely not making it. Though eventually I did, only to be met with this. The biggest gap of quicksand right before the goal ring. So I tried spamming the Gale Spear again, but I didn't have enough height and just ended up sinking into the sand. Though that's when I figured out spamming Gale Spear on incline makes you gain height. Very slowly. So I tried that on these mountainsides for a bit, but to no avail. The goal ring ceiling was just too high up to reach, so unfortunately I also have to declare this level unbeatable. Then we get to fight Silver, who I struggled with a bit, but that has nothing to do with Shadow and more so with my skills. Before going to the next stage, we have to do 3 missions. For the first one, this guard, Pietro, asks us who the captain is, which ends up being Pietro. Oh, silly Pietro, you really got me good there. Asshole. Then we get access to Soleanna New City, where we have to fight a horde of enemies, which works better with Shadow than with Sonic surprisingly. He just has more attacks to work with, so his combat feels better. After completing that, we're left with 3 shadows. Together we proceed to the entrance of the next level, which happens to be blocked by another horde of enemies we have to defeat. And after doing that, we finally move on to White Acropolis. Usually we would start with a snowboard here, but as you can see, Shadow doesn't have one, so we just walk down instead, which actually makes it a lot easier to get all these 1-ups. There aren't really any big obstacles until the snowball that chases you. It's way faster than Shadow's running speed, so it did hit me a couple times, but as long as I had rings I could make it through. Though right after we have to cross this giant gap, and I thought I could just jump and homing attack to get across, but I kept barely not making it. But this is when I actually discovered the Chaos Spear method. I was really surprised when I just spammed it in the air for a bit and then homing attacked over the gap pretty easily. I got to move on to the next part, which I could complete without any issues until I reached the Tails section, or Shadow in this case. Immediately we have to use Tails flying to cross this gap, but obviously we can't fly. And that ledge is definitely unreachable with a normal jump, so I had to look around. And luckily there is this stack of crates, which just about gives me enough height to reach this ledge with a homing attack. From there I can homing attack to the other ledges and to the searchlight, which I of course destroy because I'm really cool. And I had to progress. I then use this weird geometry of the searchlight by continuously homing attacking into it to get onto another ledge. I hit the switch and switch back to Shadow, where I run into a pretty familiar issue. Luckily I find this rock that just about gets me high enough to reach this ledge. From there everything is pretty normal. The remaining springs didn't have any issues and I reached the goal ring. The first level as Shadow that's actually beatable. We get thrown into another stage immediately, Crisis City, which also starts off with a snowboard usually. Shadow isn't a pussy though, so he just walks through the stage. No snowboard needed, until we get to this giant gap. I quickly figure out spamming the Chaos Spear works as well here. Aside from that, this section didn't really have anything stopping me, and neither did the next section really. Shadow also goes through this part in his own campaign, and there aren't many differences in the level design. The section with the floating debris also didn't give me any issues. But then we move on to the Mach Speed section, which turns into more of a relaxing walk section. Usually Sonic's speed is locked and you have to dodge the obstacles, but this was never programmed for Shadow, so you can just walk around everything. Even the tornado that's supposed to be chasing you waits for you patiently. How nice of it. After 4 minutes of slow walking, I reach the goal ring and mark this stage as beatable. We proceed to Flame Core immediately and find out that this is also basically the same layout as in Shadow's story aside from a few enemy placements, so we don't really encounter any issues until the Knuckles section. With him you have to hit 5 of these orbs in order to progress, but to reach some of them you're expected to climb these ledges, as just jumping doesn't get you high enough. Luckily there is a path to get all the way to the highest point of this room without a need for gliding or climbing, and from there you can jump down to lower platforms and reach all the orbs. From that point the rest of the level is pretty straightforward, and Flame Core is fully beatable. Next up is the fight with the vicious creature that is Iblis, and it's the exact same boss as in Shadow's story, so it's beatable. We finally get back to the hub, where we run into a bit of a problem. To access the next level you have to use Sonic's bounce on this thingy here, which Shadow can't do. You can buy the bounce bracelet, but just like the light ship, it doesn't really do anything for Shadow, so we have to find another way to the level entrance back there, since an invisible wall is blocking us. My first plan was to glitch through the wall, so I tried to get one of these metal crates that's notoriously glitchy. After kicking it all all the way from the dock to the level entrance, I tried doing a spin kick on top of it, which glitches it out sometimes. That didn't really help though, so I tried to get it at an angle so I could clip through, which looked promising, but I kept glitching through the crate instead. So I decided to take more drastic measures and use this glitch that lets Shadow clip through almost any wall. To perform it, you have to jump and pause right after, and then hold the jump button, which will simultaneously press continue and do a homing attack through the wall. The invisible wall blocking the stage itself seemed to be too thick, so I went to the left at the side of this building and was able to clip through but unable to land safely. So I decided to go a bit further left to this corner where I clipped into the building from where I could see the level entrance. So I decided to walk along this edge with some weird ass collision, and after a bunch of tries I got pretty close, but I ran into another invisible wall, though I could jump around it and homing attack back onto this sidewalk, and from there I made it to the level entrance, only to realize it doesn't work. Yeah, so all that work was for nothing. I'm assuming you have to go through the tube to get the level entrance to work, so I don't think there's any way to actually use it as Shadow. I also tried glitching into the tube, but that didn't seem to work either, so we have to use Sonic here. Though the stage itself we can play as Shadow, and it works well for the most part. You have to chase this train and stop it from running into bombs, and you'd think Shadow's slower speed would be a problem, but that's not really the case. At the start there is this part where you need to use Sonic's new bounce, and just jumping doesn't get you high enough. But there is one saving grace: this crate. Let's all take a moment to appreciate the existence of this crate. Besides that, there wasn't really anything noteworthy until the max speed section, which is more of a nice stroll. There was one big gap, but I could clear it with a jump and a homing attack. Then we get to chase Eggman's train, which is actually easier than usual. It's a little hard to keep up with, but it patiently waits for you at the end, so that makes Radical Terrain beatable. We move on to another boss, which is usually defeated by bouncing on top of its head, but since Shadow can't bounce, we had to come up with something else. But surprisingly, just spin kicking worked, which makes this boss beatable. Then we're back to the hub world, from where we need to enter Tropical Jungle, though upon this stopping us, so you have to spam Chaos Spear to get over it. So we enter the stage and are met with this camera angle. Yeah, for some reason we don't spawn on the boost pad. I slowly walk down the slope and move on to this vine. Since it works with Sonic and Silver, for sure it will work with Shadow as well. What? Okay, so I guess we have to cross this gap with a Chaos Spear, and it's not a big deal, but soon after we run into another vine. That would send me all the way up there. Yeah, there's no way I'm getting up that high. Or is there? I decided to get to the highest point I could and just scale speared for like 10 minutes towards the general direction and came across this pad that I could land on. But where does this pad come from, you may ask? Well, with Sonic you would land on top of here with the vine and walk down this pad to these springs that send you into another vine. As Shadow we can't use this vine of course, so we walk up the pad instead and jump onto the grass from there. At this point I turned on infinite lives and made a macro that let me hold the right bumper instead of repeatedly pressing square, so don't worry, my fingers are fine. Without the macro they wouldn't be though after the next section. I thought this would for sure be the end. I knew that as Sonic you had to use this special type of vine that sends you all the way down and then up. I imagined it would probably not work with Shadow either, but even getting there proved to be a struggle. There were a lot of different paths here, but there were vines plastered all over, so I went to the highest point again, jumped and started spamming Chaos Spear for hours, trying to figure out where to even go, until I saw these springs. But even when I perfectly went into their direction, I couldn't reach them. Just to test, I tried out a low gravity sheet to see if I could proceed, but no, of course the special vine doesn't work with Shadow, so Tropical Jungle as Shadow is unbeatable. Then we would usually go through Wave Ocean as Tails, but we ain't doing that today, because Shadow is going to do a way better job. We go through these conveniently placed dash rings that Tails would fly through. The stage is pretty easy at first. We just run through a bunch of loops, but then we get to this part. You can't just jump onto either of these ledges, but luckily there were some crates again to help us. Then we get to this rail I always just jump off to take a shortcut, but Shadow isn't able to reach that far easily, so we had to take the slow route which I had never been on before. I just homing attack off this rail, then homing attack this enemy and do one final homing attack to barely reach this dash ring. We run through the stage a bit more until these ledges that are a little hard to reach. But we can make it. Then I see a giant gap, and before even trying anything else, I just spam the Gale Spear for 2 minutes and barely make it with a homing attack. Though then I reach this part, which is a bit of an issue. There's no way I'm getting to that dash ring. I tried to jump from this higher part from a bit earlier and then Scale Spear, but even then the dash ring was way out of reach. And scaling the walls didn't work either, so I also have to declare this one unbeatable. Now we get to the bullshit part. Before we can move on to the next stage, we have to complete the 3 trials of Soleanna. First is the test of intelligence, where you just have to guess the right portal. I used my intelligence to skip doing this third one, but I guess I'm not that intelligent because I got a D rank. Thereafter we have the trial of courage, which was actually easier with Shadow because we could use his extra kicks for more damage. And of course the trial of love. But Shadow is a Sigma. He don't need no love. Okay, let's just pick Elise there. What have I done? Now we can finally play the level. And Sonic's first section is a breeze. There were just a few light speed dash trails that I couldn't use yet, but I could actually unlock it now if I needed to. So we make it to Silver's section, which is a bit of a different story. It immediately wants us to use Silver's telekinetic powers to bend these metal bars. So I started trying Shadow's wall clip, which worked slightly to the right of the bars. Then it wants us to throw objects at this platform to make it fall down. Luckily we can just get around this one by, you guessed it, spamming the Gale Spear. From there I could just use simple jumps and homing attacks to make it further. Until this part where you have to use Silver's telekinesis to summon crates. There was no way for me to get enough height to get up to that window. So I jumped to the left of this tower, which somehow switched me back to Sonic's section. Pleasantly surprised, I went through the next part with no sweat. It was a piece of cake, as Sonic would put it. But then we get to the most difficult Mach speed section in the game, this time requiring us to jump over gaps. Luckily we can still make the first few with Shadow's slow speed, but then the path goes sideways and we're supposed to run on the wall, and somehow that works as well. You'd think you'd need more speed to run sideways, but I guess logic doesn't apply in Sonic games. Surprisingly we can complete Kingdom Valley in its entirety. We've reached the home stretch with the final stage, Aquatic Base. But before we can enter, we have to ring 3 bells, which I kept failing at somehow. Finally in the stage we run into very little problems. It's almost like the stage was made for Shadow, with it being more combat focused. That's until we reach the Tails part, where we have to reach this pretty high up switch to progress. Luckily there's a spring that lets me get onto the middle platform, but that's not enough height to reach the switch. There just happens to be a stack of crates here though that lets me just get enough height to reach the platform, barely. Now we have another problem on our hands though, which is this section. I could reach the first platform by attacking the enemies, but the next two were too high up. I thought it was over here, like literally the "it's Jover" meme popped into my head. That's how over I thought it was. I tried Gale Spearing over to the other side, but the enemies over there made my trip short-lived. So I looked at my surroundings and I thought maybe, just maybe, I could scale this wall. So I tried it and it actually worked. I was gaining height, so I started slowly making it to the other side while maintaining my height, but then the enemies started shooting me again. Though their bullets didn't go far enough to reach me and I could homing attack to the platform, I proceeded very carefully to make sure I didn't have to do that again. I jumped to the next platform, looked at my surroundings and saw the best way was to jump over these lasers. Then there was another platform and the wall on my left looked pretty scalable as well. And I was right. Though I didn't have to climb for that long because I could homing attack this enemy. Then I finally reached this checkpoint, but we weren't done flying yet. By jumping far enough I could attack this enemy and reach the next platform, from where I could continue thanks to some floating balls. From there we can play another Sonic section, which works just as well with Shadow. Then we reached the Knuckles part, which is designed for gliding around. But of course we have our own way of gliding, so we just go from platform to platform and reach Sonic's next section. But we run into a bit of an issue. We're expected to use the bounce here to reach this pulley, but with Shadow we have to attack this enemy and then maneuver ourselves into the pulley, which is a little awkward, but it's possible. From there on it was basically just a straight shot to the finish line, and surprisingly Aquatic Base as Shadow is fully beatable. So we only have one more task ahead of us, beating Eggman. And I wish this was more climactic, but this fight is basically the exact same with Sonic, just dodge and wait for an opening, so it's fully beatable. Can we beat Sonic's story with just Shadow? No, but 6 out of 10 levels and all 5 bosses are possible, and we only had to use Sonic or Tails 5 times. But of course this is only half of the story. Next time we'll try our hand at Silver's and Shadow's own story, and of course the last story as well. So if you want to see that, subscribe and hit the little bell over there. Thanks for watching.